This week, we air our 10th pre-recorded segment called Say Easy, Do Hard. Inspired by my co-host Jason Albuquerque, we discuss AI governance in the supply chain. It's time to update our supply chain management processes to include AI governance. Easier said than done. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Ransomware, supply chain attacks, 0 days. Cyber threats don't wait, and neither should your business. With ThreatLocker, you're not just reacting to threats, you're stopping them before they start. Our Zero Trust endpoint protection locks down your environment with pinpoint control over what's allowed to run and what's not. No guesswork, no blind spots. Just proactive, built-for-now security that keeps your business moving. Want to see how a true default deny strategy works? Head over to securityweekly.com/threatlocker and take the first step towards shutting the door on threats before they even knock. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 407, recorded July 15th, 2025, but will air on August 4th, 2025 to kick off Black Hat 2025. I'm your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this interview segment, the Say Easy, Do Hard segment, is my co-host, Mr. Ben Carr. Hey, Ben.
Hey, Matt. Good to be with you today.
Good to be with you as well. Unfortunately, Jason couldn't make it, nor could Summer. When we do pre-records, it's kind of hit or miss. We'll miss them both. For this discussion, we have two CISOs joining us, so let me introduce each of them before we dive in. With over 20 years of experience in the development and implementation of new emerging technology solutions, Nick Mistry has experience leading cloud security, application security, and cyber initiatives at multinational corporations and the government. Also, Nick led technical architecture efforts to implement the U.S. federal government data consolidation program, FedRAMP, and healthcare.gov fix-it initiatives supporting DoD, GSA, and CMS, respectively. Nick, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thank you.
We're going to dig in a second, but our next CISO coming in live is Richard Bird. He's the Chief Security Officer for Singular AI, an AI security and governance solution, and a 6-time C-level executive in the corporate and startup worlds, internationally known for his observations on AI security, data privacy, digital consumer rights, and identity security. Richard currently focuses his attention on the operationalization of AI and how we can secure, govern, and control the use of AI effectively. Richard, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Good to be here.
All right, gentlemen. So we're going to talk about AI governance in the supply chain. But before we go there, I want your kind of input on third party versus supply chain. I've had this conversation a lot, by the way. Do we consider them to be the same, or is supply chain a subset of my third party risk management program? Who wants to start with that one?
Nick, I'll give you the floor on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take that one first. It's a good question, right? And the way I see it is that when you're building software or you're building capabilities, you're pulling in open source. Open source is 90+% of modern software today. Does that belong in a third-party risk management program? I'm not sure, because when you're purchasing or bringing in third parties, they too are using software components, 90% of which is open source as well. And I see that as part of the supply chain. So supply chain lives in both worlds, but I do think the challenges and how you address them are unique, whether it's obviously things that you're building by leveraging open source, or things that you're buying or using through a partner or more traditional third party, and that's where usually third party risk management falls. Is it all third party? In a way it is, but you kind of manage the risks and deal with those risks differently with different skill sets and different capabilities than to also remediate, if you will, and then manage the risk. It's really what you have control over, right? And if you're building internal capabilities, you have a lot more control. If you're using third-party vendors or acquiring it, That way, you obviously are working with them to identify those risks and mitigate those risks. But they are both supply chain risk issues.
Yeah, Richard, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd align with Nick, but take a slightly different path on that answer. In that, I've always looked at the third-party risk space, going back to my corporate career, as the kind of um, the standard IT support solution software processes people that allow the business to run. When I look at supply chain, I look at that from the standpoint of a different nexus of trust, right? A supply chain to me is classically built on the old Ford, Model T model, which is there are inputs coming from other sources, other systems that allow me to deliver my services, right? So when I look at, Microsoft Office, do I consider that to be supply chain? Absolutely not, right? I consider that to be part of my third-party risk program, and I'm going to evaluate that security and the capabilities of that solution as a consumer of that. But when I look at the suppliers that are providing, whether they're digital or physical, providing things that manifest in my product or enable the delivery of that product, say a logistics system, then I have a different eye for that. And I do think, Nick, I think you hinted at it, but I think that we've kind of munged together everything under a third-party umbrella. And unfortunately, what that's resulted in is like really weird experiences. And I always like to share this one because it's a personal pet peeve. I sign off on third-party risk questionnaires constantly on the solution side. And I have not worked for anything other than a SaaS company, the last 4 solution companies that I've worked at. And there's always the same question on the third-party risk management questionnaire, which is, please provide us the address for your data center.
Yeah.
Right? That's a very third-party risk management focused question, and obviously very inaccurate in a SaaS-based world these days. But to me, that's a reflection of the problems that we've created by kind of mashing everything together under a third-party risk umbrella, as opposed to treating the risk of business operations and efficiency and resiliency, and all the other risks that come with our trusted partners that are associated to our supply chain.
Yeah.
Yeah, Richard, you made that interesting analogy, which is Microsoft Office, right? Which I think works for a lot of people, but it's still like you could consider Microsoft Office as part of the stuff you use to make your product, right? In some form or fashion. I've always escalated and looked at it as like, look, we could be the supplier to someone else, right? They're certainly not in our supply chain, but they are a third party to us. Like we do have some integration. And so as a third party, there is some risk to that. And I have to say, like, is the business we're willing to provide to them worth the risk that we're willing to take on? And when you evaluate that, yeah, it becomes hard for a lot of people in the business that don't understand the nuance of it to get that. But I think you guys both hit on a lot of the key topics there and points.
Yeah, if I could just follow on with it real quick, I think there's a really interesting differentiation dimension that you put in there. If Microsoft Word goes out in a large enterprise company, right, it becomes unavailable. Delivery of services, achieving of revenue and profit, for me as a company, are probably only jeopardized in a very minor way, right? And that's the way that I look at supply chain, right? Which is, if there's a bad day in the supply chain, and a great breach incident. Yeah, the CrowdStrike or Twilio, right? Yeah. Twilio took a massive outage, and because it was the primary SMS provider to a lot of companies, people were not able to sign on when they went to work. That, to me, is the different dimensions of that risk. But I think you're absolutely right. We're unfortunately all exposed to Microsoft to a level that they're certainly part of a supply chain in some way, right?
Yeah, it's all intertwined now, right? Like you can be affected by a third party supplier that's really a fourth or fifth party supplier to you because it takes out your third party. So yeah, it's a weird ecosystem that we're working in.
I did this on purpose because I've had this conversation with others who equate them to be the same, and I don't. I typically think of the supply chain as almost a unique component of a broader third-party risk management program because they are a third party, but because they're supplying certain capabilities, hardware, software, whatever, the way you assess them should be different. And Richard, I think you brought this up. We've kind of just munged it all together and treat them all the same. And we ask the same questions. It's like, no. we don't, or we shouldn't be.
You shouldn't be caring about the risk the same, right, Matt? Like
exactly.
we should look at that risk differently, and that should be a break point.
Yeah, I think that's the underlying point, right? Is that ultimately we're doing all of this to understand risk, and the risk in terms of identifying and quote and ultimately managing that risk is very different. And I think that's the point you're making. And I would definitely
exactly. And it ties into this topic, which is when we look at AI challenges in the supply chain, and we will talk about what changes do we need to make. One could argue that, okay, I'm using AI, I'm using Copilot from Microsoft. That use of AI has a very different risk profile than embedding Claude or OpenAI or one of these AI models into my software, right? Like they're very different. And I did this on purpose so we could differentiate what we're talking about, which is more of the how do I embed and manage these different AI models into my solution as part of a supply chain versus the Copilots of the world, which are, glorified chatbots, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So let's dig in. Let's start with some current challenges. So I pulled in a couple articles in support of this segment, just for listeners if they want to see some data later. So I pulled in a CSO article that was actually written July 1st, so 2 weeks ago. Talks about AI supply chain threats loom as security practices lag. This is part of the basis for this conversation. And there's some really interesting areas in here that they talk about around flaws and malicious code. So Nick, kind of talk to us a little bit, because I think you see this, you both probably see this as well, but what are some of the big challenges you're seeing when it comes to AI adoption from these different supply chain providers?
Yeah, so I think, the article in particular, cites some things that we've known for a little while, right? And I think there have been some progress made on those as well. So one is, the models or LLMs will hallucinate, and they will come up with open source. When you're building software, they'll recommend open source packages that may not exist, right? Or don't exist in the way that we think they do or what they provide. So that's challenge number one. And what's happening is we know there are theoretically we can create or anticipate what those hallucinated packages are, and the adversaries can create a package that matches that, and lo and behold, and we've seen this happen, right, as well, where they create a malicious package that now it becomes part of the software. So that's one. I think that's called sloppo squatting, which is, to me, is kind of like a form of typo squatting, where typo squatting was before AI, right? A human being would create a typo of a package. The adversaries know that's a common typo or think it's a common typo, and instead it's a malicious package that you download. So that's number one. But then the other issues that we're also finding, within these LLMs that are either generating code or recommending fixes, is they are also not always picking the best packages, right? Open source packages, which is interesting because the information is there, right? The information is available to understand the risks of these open source packages. So so even if it's not malicious, they're not necessarily able to produce the level of rigor around assessing what's safe or more secure from a supply chain perspective. So there's areas of improvement there from both of those angles that we're finding.
Now, is that only from a vibe coding use case perspective, where the vibe coding AI is actually pulling in less secure packages?
Yeah, it's not only from vibe coding, but we've actually seen it in some of the security-oriented products that are recommending fixes, right? And so the other challenge is, okay, now we have security tools that are saying, hey, we're going to recommend a safer open source component. And what they're not accounting for, not yet at least, and this is where there's a lot of progress being made, is understanding software structure, right? Just because a version has fewer vulnerabilities doesn't mean it's necessarily better based on the software you're writing. So that's another area of evolution as well. So not just in vibe coding, but then these other tools that are recommending alternatives or better, quote unquote, open source thing.
Now, when I think about open source, traditionally I've thought about open source from a package component, but that definition's expanding now, because you now have these open source models. How do they get integrated, and what are some of the challenges around integrating these models? Because look, everybody's running to try to use this stuff, which is interesting. And we've been doing some stuff on it in my day job, but they're not all the same, right? They're very different, and how they get deployed and how you secure them is very different. How do you think through some of those challenges?
Richard, you want to take that one first, and I'm happy to.
No, I'm going to say no because I kind of circling back to the original question. So maybe if I could dive on that first,
Yeah,
and
go
then
ahead.
Nick, picture that back over to you.
Sure.
And I'm sorry. This is what I'm known for, being the cranky old contrarian pragmatist. It tickled me a little bit, Matt, when you said early on that like people are out there doing this and security's got to catch up. Security's always been behind.
Yeah.
Right. Why? And it's not an AI thing. I mean, and so I think a lot of the conversations that we're having around, whether it's code security, open source, Hugging Face, whatever, activities are going on in the developer community. This is not me throwing stones, but developers have never been great at security, right? And frankly, if your security program relies on everybody else getting smarter about security, you're kind of doomed, right? Because a developer's job
Unfortunately, developers don't get paid to be security conscious,
exactly.
right? Like
There's no
the
incentive
incentives don't
structure.
match. Like
Yeah,
we talked about this way back in the day, right? There was this challenge of, fix this vulnerability, but the ops guys are compensated on uptime. And so every time they fix a vulnerability, it impacts their motivation, right? Because
yep.
that's how they get paid. The same thing here.
And there's a beautiful and scary thing about AI, whether it's Gen AI or agentic. It operates without prejudice, right? It is when I have this conversation, people are like, "Well, it's Skynet," and I'm like, "Well, tell me which character in Skynet," and they go, "Well, it's T-800," and I'm like, "Arnold was the hero. You obviously didn't watch the whole thing, right? T-1000, T-1000, kill John Connor." Right. The coded mission is what AI achieves. It does lead to things like hallucinations or kind of this pleasing dilemma of wanting to return the answer that you've put in from an objective bias or an observational bias standpoint, which includes developers. So as we look at this, what we see is a technology that is very able to take what's been given to it and act in an immediate and urgent way. And then when we look at it from the standpoint of API key and secrets management, or we look at it from code quality, slop squatting or typo squatting, whatever else is going on in these packages, the expectation that the introduction of AI is going to change developer behavior is absolutely absurd, right? It's not going to happen, right? The other thing is that these coding learning bases that are being put into these coding engines aren't pure algorithmic. Here's this language. Here's how you construct and compile. It's learning based upon human developer experience, right? And if those behaviors are manifesting in those agents, then what does that mean? And so I'll kind of come back, and Nick, I want to toss that other question back at you, because maybe I've opened up a can of worms that is associated with that question, but it raises this issue of, does the introduction of Gen AI and agentic in a supply chain world or in a third-party risk world, is it a place where we are going to be heavily visited by the sins of our past from a security standpoint, right? XAI has accidentally exposed keys that have allowed access to over 100 of their models over the course of the last 6 months. That's a human misconfiguration error that caused an exposure that's allowing access to potentially manipulate and maneuver, the outputs and the responses from a bunch of stuff in XAI. Those are the kind of problems that we're going to see happening, in exponential fashion over the course of the next 2 to 3 years.
So you opened up a bunch of topics there
He
to
did.
dive into. Like there's a whole session on this, right? So, my first question is, Look, are we failing because look, I think the development community at their core should be the ones that understand the most that AI isn't making intelligence-based decisions. It's making probability-based decisions based upon data that it's fed, right?
Yeah.
And so they should understand that it's not reasoning that it's going to use better code or more secure code or protect things because it's the right thing to do. It's just learning on, what it's been fed. And that's, I think, part of the problem. And I'm amazed that security in general, but also the development community hasn't come to this general concept as a principle of what AI is right now, right? And that's one. And then secondly, you raised Terminator, which I always live when somebody raises Terminator in the AI discussion. And my concern, my question before you went to Terminator, but it goes it perfectly isn't the problem the speed of evolution on this, right? Like we're doing things so much faster that security isn't catching up to it. Like we're just like, yes, there's always been a problem of security being a little bit behind the eight ball, but it's that Moore's law thing on steroids where it's just hockey sticking. I don't know if we can keep up. So anyway, those were 2 points. A lot of discussion there, but I wanted to bring both of them up because you raised some good points.
Well, I'll catch the last one first because look, I did my first Secure from the Start AppSec program in probably 2008 or 2009, right? There is a truth, there is a truth in the speed and volume velocity being a lot more, which also raises the question of how are we going to address that with security tools that are enabled with AI, right? And I think that there is a fighting chance there, but we have to really come back to the way that organizational structures have developed. So you mentioned the incentive piece. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's right-hand man for years, said, "Show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes."
Yeah.
Right? If there's no incentive compensation component for developers that's associated with security, you're never going to get security there. Take a look at those AppSec programs that used to be in my security shop in '09. Most of them aren't even in security anymore, right?
Yeah.
Those AppSec programs have been moved into different leaders within the organization. So what are you telling the CISO? It's only your problem when it goes bad, right? But you actually don't have any levers or any ability to control it. So I think that I actually have a tremendous amount of optimism that today's up and coming security tools that are AI focused, AI enabled, can reap huge benefits for us and help us. But we also can't have things happening like AI development engines that have no notion of security guardrails or guidelines, right? Because that's the scenario that yields the worst possible outcome if there's no guardrails or guidelines or baselines within those agentic coding models that enforce some level of base security.
Yeah. So Nick, before you answer, just one quick point here, because but I think it's important, right? Is that if we have not fully shifted left from a DevSecOps perspective, which is part of this conversation, right? If we haven't moved security left in our development pipeline, isn't AI just accelerating the gap that we haven't solved for in DevSecOps and just making us, and we're getting further behind?
Yeah, no, I think that's a valid point, right? And so I think, a few things. One is I'll start off by saying that, I think there's an opportunity to shift even further left. And by that, I mean is looking at we're talking about supply chain, right? So software is one of the few industries where we ask people to go build software with stuff that they can pick on their own, right? Without a lot of validation, and then ask somebody else to fix it when they find a bunch of issues. You know what I'm saying? So if you go to any other industry, there's really strict controls on the what you source, right? You mentioned the other supply chains, right? There's a lot of controls around that, and you don't tell the technician who builds a car to pick whatever bolt he or she wants to use, right? It doesn't work that way, but in software it does, and for a good reason, right? A lot of innovation drives that behavior. So I do think there is a tremendous opportunity to shift further left, which is looking at what you're sourcing and gaining a lot more transparency. Right? The software bill of materials efforts that have been, trying to take off, I think, are a legitimate first step in really understanding what everything is in those components. What are all the risks? And now AI obviously is accelerating contributions to open source. It's all doing, again, great adding to the innovation that's out there. That said, I think AI can also be used to help understand what you're sourcing, all of the risks in what you're sourcing, and then understanding how to protect yourself from those, identifying what's good, what is risky, and then how do you treat those much before you even bring it, let's say, into your CI/CD pipeline, right? I have that understanding. And then the other, I think, where we're seeing, at least me personally, I'm seeing a lot of benefit. It's kind of like, okay, how do you secure AI and how do you use AI for security, right? I think they're both in play simultaneously, which I think makes it incredibly exciting right now to be in this space, right? Because you're really trying to do both, and you have to do both. And where I see a lot of promise for AI helping drive security, one is identifying what you're bringing into your system ahead of time and making sure they meet the right security requirements, and then also removing the burden from develop. So by doing that, you're removing the burden from developers of having to pick, what was called risky open source. All right, that's number one. Number two is then, all right, you have this already in your source code, you have it in your containers. A lot of this can be auto remediated, right? Especially with agentic AI breaking down the steps. So you're not like, what I think we're evolving to, which is a good thing, is the old world. I'll call it old world. Maybe 2 weeks ago, you had AppSec teams scan and find a bunch of risks and vulnerabilities, and you go through this whole process. Okay, contextualize it, and then they throw it over to the app teams. App teams say, "InfoSec, you have no idea what you're talking about. It's not even used in the software. These components that you're flagging as vulnerable." So where I think AI, and this is where I'm seeing it go, and I think there's a lot of promise. It merges both teams actually closer together, because it'll help understand software structure, do that contextualization in real time, and understand and prioritize how to remediate and also execute the remediation.
So Nick, I'm sorry to tell you, but that process you just described happened today.
Yeah.
In lots of companies, right?
Yeah.
It did.
Yeah.
So
it continues to happen. Yes.
Exactly. So we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
And so that's part of this. That's why I brought up that point, right? If we haven't figured out our DevSecOps processes, right? And you bring up an interesting point, but I'm gonna pull my inner Richard for a second, because I've been doing this a long time. We suck at asset management. But that's kind of what you said we should be doing, right? We should be doing an inventory to identify the potential software assets that we can pull from, but we're so bad at it. Like, I wish we could, but how do we get there, I guess?
Yeah, no, but we can, right? And so this is where it's evolving. Is first is, what do we need to do and agree on doing it, and moving away from reactive, right? And so things that we're actively working on is scanning actual open source. We scan our private code, identify open source. We can actually scan the open source packages using the same tooling. We can find the same types of risks and identify similar risks, and we can add additional risk vectors. And then supply chain attacks, we can look at build code versus source code, do understand tampers. All of that is available, and with AI, just speeds up that entire process. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to what you're saying is get greater visibility into that inventory and its risks, and then remediating it. And the capability is now there to do it at scale, which is what I find exciting. Now,
yeah. So do you see like building a kind of a central reputational database of open source that says, here's all the open source, here's the potential risks of this open source, you decide what you want to use, but go in eyes wide open? Because that would be really interesting, right? Like that would change the way we think about what do we pull in to our softwares.
Absolutely. And that's what we are building. But is there going to be one central database? I don't think it's going to be one. I think there's going to be multiple sources. I think what's going to be interesting is agreeing on what safe and secure means. I think for too long we've been focused on safe meaning CVEs, and it's a little broader, I think, in definition than CVEs.
Yeah, it is, for sure. Trust me. I've worked for 2 vulnerability management companies. It's beyond CVEs, folks. Definitely, for sure. So, all right, we're starting to head there. I want to start getting into the do hard part, which is, we've identified some of the challenges. Let's start with, what are some of the things missing in our existing processes, and where do we need to change? Like, what are the changes we really need to start thinking about in our supply chain process? Because this is the hard part, I think, for most people is, all right, I hear you. I got a problem. What do I do about it? So where do we start? I don't know if that's Richard or Nick, but I'll take it from either source.
Well, I'll jump in, and there's, this will be an unpopular opinion, but but it's coming up as a conversation recently, which is I think we have been conditioned for 30 years. This is my 31st year in technology and security. I think we've been conditioned for 30 years to constantly use the term risk in security as if we actually understand what it means. And when I go have conversations with people, because by accident, I'm actually a formally trained risk manager. And when I go talk to people in security and technology about risk, they start talking about things, and I'm like, show me that on a Pareto chart, right? And you just see the blank stares. And I'm like, there are an entire, group of tools and mechanisms to be able to calculate risk based upon probabilities and those types of things, based upon inputs and likelihood of occurrence. And and because we've spent so much time allowing the security trade to use risk as the rationalization, while that same security trade is not really good at that particular function, we've missed the fact that, and I love the way that my old friend John Kindervag says this, it's not risk, it's damage control. Right. Your job in security is to try and find the things that will cause the most harm to your company. If something should happen, there is a risk dimension to that. But if you apply it that way, and I love the talk about CVEs. If you would look at a vulnerability from a damage standpoint, we might not have 9-year-old vulnerabilities that are now being exploited in the systems, because we never remediated them, because from a risk standpoint, they didn't really rise to the top of the line. But from a damage standpoint, what they can do and what they can control is devastating. So when I look at our conversation specifically around AI, I'm always asking the first question of companies that I'm talking with, which is, if an AI agent was involved in this flow and it shut off X, Y, or Z, tell me what happens next, right? What I love about AI and what I would really hope people are starting to think about is, for the very first time, our security architectures, if you go back to 83, OSS bandstand, right? 7-layer model. If we go a little bit further to the early 90s, Raytheon Hughes drops his defense in depth, which, if you look at the diagrams, is actually a layer around the OSI 7-layer model. And the zero trust folks hate when I say this, but in truth, what zero trust demands is verify and validate all the things in the bandstand and all the things on the DID layer, right? And the reality is that we built all of those architectures to protect the stuff inside, primarily data. AI is transactional, right? AI might not be interested in your data at all. AI might blow up an entire assembly line function. AI might take and embed something within a software delivery that manifests as a problem later. And so now we've moved into a world of transactional security that AI is forcing us into, and these old models and architectures simply cannot adapt. So I'll go back to the question about us keeping up. Well, if we're using 35, 40, 45-year-old security architectures in a landscape where AI's behavior doesn't fit nicely within those three constructs, what do? Right? We better start thinking quickly about what that looks like from a pure transactional security standpoint, and what part of that transaction will manifest the most damage in my organization.
I totally agree. And if I can just add to that, right, the need to create a new construct. Now take AI, and I forget the article, I was trying to remember, but it was published in a peer-reviewed journal where they the AI can now, simple chat GPT type AI, can create exploits for about 75% of critical known vulnerabilities. So if you're prioritizing based on CVEs and saying there's no active exploit and so on and so forth, so that's already changing, right? I mean, so throw that into this risk management dynamic, now you're assessing risk very differently already, right? So, and AI can also do vulnerability chaining, right, at scale. You could have a bunch of low CVEs out there, chain them appropriately, and then and now you've created a very high risk situation. So I completely agree with Richard, right? We're in an environment that we need to look at the whole risk management. And I also agree, security hasn't done a historically good job of risk management in the pure sense. So I think there's an opportunity to change that. That said, I also see AI enabling us to respond, observe, understand, and respond much more rapidly, as well as do it much more effectively by removing a lot of the burden off developers and seeing what AI can do in terms of remediation.
Yeah, well, I'm with both of you on the whole risk management CVE conversation, because look, every vendor in under the sun has created their own risk score, and they're all meaningless. They're all normalized qualitative numbers that don't really mean anything at the end of the day, right? And so if we're using vulnerabilities as our measure of risk, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. So I'm with you on that one for sure. And that is something that I think we have to continue to work through. But some of the other points that you brought up and that were part of the conversations are, how do we change though? If we're using archaic approaches and technologies and architectures, what do we need to change to? Like, not that I want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but some days I want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, Nick, what should we be doing now to walk away from that old architecture and put us on a path to better manage this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I don't think there's an answer today, but there are some leading indicators of what that answer should look like, right? And some of the things, one is I'll start with, and you mentioned the challenge of inventory. To me, that's the challenge of transparency, right? Is really understanding, and how do you gain transparency, whether it's the LLM models that you're bringing in and using, or the open source components, or a combination, right? Usually it's a combination of application open source components with embedded LLMs or use of LLMs, and then the data that it's trained on. So one is, we need to think about transparency very seriously, and these are solvable problems in getting clarity and transparency of what the data that's being used to train these models, what are the underlying models themselves, what's the lineage of those models, and then how are we embedding those in applications, what are the other open source components that are wrapped around it. So that's number one. I think transparency is key. The other piece to that is, okay, now that you have transparency, is remediation is a constant activity. It's not a, hey, I scanned.
Point in time.
It's not a point in time. It's got to be continuously detecting and remediating and doing it at scale, and leveraging automation to do that. So that's the other part of this framework, is point in time is not working at all for us. And then the third, that leads to this whole have inventory, which is transparency, have auto remediation or reaction time that's much faster than scan, and then put in some ticket somewhere and it gets addressed later. And then the third piece is really need to remove the burden off the developer community, like adding more and more to developers, even if it's like suggestion in an IDE, all good, but you're just adding to what we're expecting people to do. That's not, I think, ultimately realistic for them to do. So I think this new model needs to be a continuous kind of assessment and reaction that doesn't end, right? It's not like, hey, we got all greens this month, so we're good, right? I don't think it works that way anymore.
Yeah, I mean, transparency is, to me, and understanding your inventory is a huge part of this. I want to talk about continuous scanning, continuous remediation, right? Because the remediation side scares people still to this day. Like, nobody wants to patch a system or remediate something that takes down the system. How do we effectively do automated remediation?
We'll trust it to do the coding on the front side.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that's not a problem, right? But remediation, no way.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
As long as it's in the dev pipeline, it's fine. But if it's in the security guy's bailiwick, then no, we don't want anything to do with that.
So if I could just take that real quick, and then I'll hand it over to Richard, because I know he's probably had a lot in this area. But what to me is really encouraging is, as I mentioned earlier, there's an opportunity to really finally merge the two disciplines, right, and make them much closer aligned. So one approach that I know has been working is, yeah, we auto remediate, but let's create a new branch, right? Let's fix it. Don't bypass your test. It's good. So the remediation acts like another member of the team, but it's AI that's doing it,
Oh,
if
I
that
see.
makes sense.
Yeah.
The audits are still there, it still generates a Jira ticket, it still does the manifest, upload the manifest, the P. So all of what you've already built and instrumented is still applying, the testing still applies, but you're dramatically improving the time of it. You're doing other analyses to say, yeah, the success rate of this is going to be high, that it's not going to break something, because you're doing the software structure dependency analysis all through automation. That's where I see the opportunity. So yeah, auto remediate, but don't bypass your existing controls that you have in place.
Use the existing CI/CD pipeline
Yeah.
to make the fix, create a branch, test the branch, validate it, then push it to production.
Correct.
And continue. And just do that continuously.
Yeah, and then use AI to accelerate a lot of it. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
Look, I got to get to the core of the problem here. This idea that remediation is going to take out production for me is a self-sustaining myth that we haven't been able to get rid of for decades. It is not supported by evidence. It is not supported by data. It's how I feel, right? And we have look. I'm going to tick some people off. We have some very sensitive senior level executives who have no proof that auto remediation will shut off production, and they still buy that nonsense, right? And you can just take it as simple as, show me in your industry segment you can go put this in ChatGPT and go get a response out of it. In the last 10 years in your industry segment, show me the number of incidents where production was taken down by hackers, exploits, and breaches, and compare that to the percentage of time that production went down because there was some auto remediation activity in your environment, right? It is nonsensical, right? But it is something that we've allowed to propagate. And it is, unfortunately, I put this squarely on the shoulder of business leaders. I want my code, I want it now. I want my product, I want it now. I want my revenue, I want it now. Right. And then when you go, well, what happens when your production gets taken out? Because once again, some developer managed to expose private keys, right? And now you have a serious problem. Well, that's securities issue, right? And I'm going to kind of loop back around to, again, man, you made me chuckle. I egregiously name drop all of my old friends because they have the best quotes ever. But Chase Cunningham once, when we were sitting talking about DevSecOps, said, "You know why DevSecOps doesn't exist?" He said, "Because tell me who owns it in the company." Right? Nobody owns it from a leadership standpoint. It's an idea, it's a notion, it's a philosophy, it's a strategy, right? And when the business can dictate to a technology organization, take all of the guardrails off, go, 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 and then the security organization rises up and says, this is going to manifest badly. Can we remediate this code? And the business leader says, no, no, no. If you remediate, you might take production out. We have this like Mobius strip infinity loop of misery that we're creating for ourselves. And it comes back to let auto remediation fly. Matter of fact, if you're really good at your development cycles, you would have the people that were necessary to be able to catch whatever needs to be caught in the safety net if in the lowest probability likelihood, some form of auto remediation fails, right? But instead, we just complain that this is some kind of problem when it's actually a myth, and we never come back around and address the actual, root cause and truth and the data and the evidence and where that should lead us in terms of our decision making.
Yeah.
So Richard, hold on one second. You got Dev going, go, 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 go. You got security saying no, 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 no. Nick, what you said is we see these merging together. So my question becomes, who owns this?
Yeah,
because again, if nobody owns DevSecOps, then who owns the AI governance supply chain process, right? Who owns it? Because somebody has to own it, right?
Yeah, so I it's really interesting. I'm starting to see a change, and it's very small, not minor though. And I'm hoping that I'm making reference to the second company accurately. I know that for the first company, it's true. Yeti has made a decision to move its entire IT organization up under security.
Oh,
And
Yeah.
I believe that Anthropic has done the same. This is super interesting. This goes back to what we were talking about. We're operating with 30, 40-year-old organizational structures and compensation models.
right.
Like what an interesting
Yeah, I'm seeing more and
move.
more of that. That was my role at Crossroads. They moved IT under me, and I'm seeing more and more of that as I talk. At the time, it was kind of rare and odd and threw a lot of people in consternation. But
Yeah.
especially in tech, smaller startup stuff, I'm hearing a lot of that as it just makes more sense that way.
Yeah, I mean it's a really interesting way to address ownership problems, organizational structure problems, efficiency problems, oversight problems,
I still think you have the problem though. It doesn't necessarily address Matt's alignment problem because a lot of the prod stuff is under the CTO or under product or CPO, right?
right.
It's
Yeah,
not the IT that we have. Like IT went away, kind of, right? And we're like, well,
sure.
who's going to handle the remainder of what's left of IT? Give it to the security guy, right?
Right.
And
Right.
the CPO and the CTO have kind of elevated, and that's where I normally see the friction. Do you see it the same way, Richard, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I see, I mean, it's interesting you say that because I see CTOs that are trying to understand their place in the world
Yeah.
these days. When CTOs in our day were, purely infrastructure aligned,
Hmm.
right? CIOs who, for a very long time, in my experience, were really CDOs, right?
Yeah.
They weren't over, large tranches of application development and that. Now that's changed substantially. CISOs, we've kind of seen a world that's diminished a little bit in the footprint space. Like I said, AppSec programs that don't report to them, encryption or crypto, activities that don't report to them, and so I do think that the business world is really struggling to try and figure out how to architect an organization that addresses, current state and common state problems. But obviously, it will go back to what we already said. It's a small percentage. The vast majority of enterprises and organizations are trying to deal with an interesting new variation of patterns that we've seen before with technologies that are really taxing us. And it's the old hammer and nail problem. I walk into companies and they go, well, I have a hammer. We've seen this AI problem before. It's a nail. And I'm like, no, it's not quite a nail. Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
it might be a little bit more different than a nail. It actually might be a drywall screw, and a hammer's not going to be your best choice, right?
Well,
Like
I've seen companies
yeah, I got
trying
a
to
lot of work
solve
to
it
do there.
by adding a chief AI officer, and that just seems to add more complexity and consternation, right? It's like we're
So
adding more C-level titles to address a problem that its core isn't a C-level
Right.
problem, right? It's
red
different.
herring, red herring question. How long until AI just becomes technology?
Yeah.
I
Well,
give that like I give like on the inside of 36 months.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we're already
I would agree.
partially there with vibe coding in some respects, right? It's writing code. Next thing you know, it's going to deploy its own infrastructure. It could be the technology and the infrastructure like all in one, because what's to stop it if we let it build its own code? Then deploying infrastructure's code is next, and here we go, right?
Sounds like I heard Terminator again come up.
Yeah, kinda.
I think,
But what's
I,
to stop
but
it?
I think, yeah, I think that's exactly right. I foresee it moving in that direction. I think we've already seen signs of that, and it makes sense, right? It's the why not, right? And then, but the question I think I want to address earlier, organizational structure. I don't know, right? There's a lot in flux, as you guys all have mentioned. I have seen CTOs and CPOs though step up into understanding risk only because especially product companies are getting more and more required to provide more transparency, required to address risks, and it impacts their bottom line, right? And so I'm starting to see CPOs, CTOs starting to lean in because of the market pushback, liability pushback through regulations and other things like that are small but emerging. I think maybe one answer, and this is one I personally have loved throughout my career, right? Is can security, and I think the answer is yes, can security actually gain efficiency if done correctly, right? This was the promise of DevSecOps to begin with, and I think we're there. I think we can. Can we do this in a way that so do you talk about auto remediation or just choosing better components, understanding risk in the beginning? there is science and a lot of evidence to say, yes, that actually drives efficiency, right? Because you're going to have to patch it or deal with this in the back end, whether it's a breach, whether it's an incident, whether it's, meeting your vulnerability patch management requirements, whatever it is, right? There is a cost there. And can we reduce that cost, free up more developer time to do the other things? And my observation is, yes, there is. How do we do that? I don't know if I got a full answer for it, but I think that's maybe where we chip at it, is there is a business case here, and the business case is more security, more efficiency.
Yeah, and
So
I
Nick,
think well, hold on one second, because I think this goes to Richard's point a little bit about we have to throw away some of the old architecture models.
Yeah.
Right? In security. Unfortunately, guys, we do, right? So many people are latched on to the components that have been part of the old architectures. If you get there, you almost have to re-architect parts of that security program to be ready for the new world, not the old world. Man, I'm telling you, there's certain security industry areas that are very, very long in the tooth. I'm not sure they're providing a lot of value, but they're still hanging around. And if we don't get rid of those, I don't know that we get more efficient. That's all.
So are you saying that 40 years on, cybersecurity, information security, and enterprise has become an institutionalized corporate function, and there's politics and there's culture and there's I thought everyone just went to all the conferences and then bought all the cool new stuff and came home and implemented it. This whole corporate aspect, it would be a conversation for another time that I think would be great. It's a model that I'm actually working on as a side hobby, but it's actually in reference to my career at JP Morgan Chase. One of the things that I find really interesting, Nick, about how do you change things, and we talked a lot about the organizational and incentive stuff. But one of the things that's really, really interesting is that in the vast majority of companies, security is free. Right? It is a top line expense, right? It is not cost allocated on a unit cost basis out to everybody that consumes it within an organization. It is the only technology function like that. You don't have a pool of laptops that you just pull from and you don't get charged for as a leader of a line of business. You don't have square footage, for queue farms, and you don't pay for that square footage. Yet within security, we have this, misguided notion that the reason that companies invest in security is because it's the right thing to do, and no company ever passed a business case based upon it being the right thing to do. Not in technology or security,
No.
right? Yeah, and so this idea of how do we change behaviors and structures? How do we get to efficiency and productivity? Is to stop treating security like it is some kind of static, passive insurance policy, and funding it that way, right? And really incorporate it. What I find interesting, I was having a conversation with a very well-known security leader at a very large manufacturing organization with a tremendous amount of technology in what they manufacture. And he said, well, it's really interesting you say that. And it goes from a product side. He said, we always have cost components for security for every single product, right? He says, but we don't have any cost components for security for any of our enterprise security. He goes, that is a mismatch that I'm going to go talk to my organization about. Why wouldn't we be understanding? I mean, how do you understand inefficiency if you don't know what efficiency looks like? How do you understand inefficiency if you don't have a baseline to measure it against? Where are the metrics of performance for security as a function? In the vast majority of cases, all we do is look at the laundry list of vulnerabilities that we've mitigated and those that we haven't. And then that's kind of about the best metric, right? And we should be much further along from that from a business acumen standpoint. And that's got to change.
Yeah. That is one of the big changes. I mean, we talk about that a lot on this podcast because we talk about these issues, but I agree with you, Richard. Like if as a CISO, we're reporting my patch rates and how many incidents and my phishing simulation metrics, like we're never going to be in the risk conversation and how this impacts a business. So yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, and use the phishing example. And the same 5% have failed that phishing exercise every year, and not one single one of them has been terminated.
Right.
Well, it's the same 5% over and over again.
Yeah, well, it's because it's the guy that runs this big division that produces the most revenue. We can't fire him or her, right?
No matter what the evidence and data tells us.
Exactly. Gentlemen, this has been an awesome conversation. I want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. If you're attending Black Hat, we hope to see you there. Otherwise, we'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.